Hey girl, Marissa here. You are listening to the Codependent Dummy podcast. As a young woman, you have been raised, reinforced, and rewarded for putting the needs of others above your own. Now, in your 20s, you're finding yourself exhausted, exasperated, and enveloped in shit relationships, especially the one you have with yourself. Codependency is a way of being where we put the feelings, wants, and needs of others above our own in an unconscious attempt to meet our own feelings, wants, and needs. Sorry to break it to you, sis, but that is not sustainable. This podcast is to help you undo all that so you can stop playing small and start taking up space, you dummy. Let's get to it. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Codependent Dummy podcast. Today, we are talking with Tomiko Mackey. Tomiko is a licensed clinical social worker in private practice and the owner of Mackey Counseling Services. She is certified in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and she's also trained in EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. She provides teletherapy to children, adolescents, and adults who have experienced trauma or are dealing with depression or anxiety. Tomiko is licensed in California and Mississippi. Thank you for coming on, Tomiko.
Thank you for having me, Marissa. It's good to be here.
Yes. All right. So we'll start with the typical 2 questions. I'm curious, Tomiko, how do you conceptualize codependency?
So as you and I were just talking about that, I think that I don't really think of the clients I work with in terms of codependency, but certainly when you think about the definition of what codependency is, my younger clients as well as my older clients have symptoms or behaviors that are codependent, right? And so I think about relationship and how the children or the adolescents move in relationship, and it's relationship with caregivers, relationships with friends, relationship with romantic partners. And as I think about the adults, again, relationships, romantic relationships, professional relationships, personal relationships, and how much of themselves are they maybe sacrificing or giving over. When I think about the word codependency, but I also really conceptualize, what is the behavior that I am that they're describing, and how is that affecting and in some cases interfering with positive, healthy relationships. How is it, are there barriers that they've erected as a result of, whatever trauma or whatever experiences they've had. And then the other thing, as I'm saying this, is attachment, right? How does attachment link to codependency? What are those 2 relationships? And, attachment as children, and then attachment as adults, what does that look like?
Right.
So when I think, so that's kind of how I conceptualize codependency.
You just posed this question. I'm curious, how does attachment relate to codependency? How do you sense it relates?
Sure. So, if we talk about young kids, are they securely attached? Are they avoidant in their attachment? What is their attachment with their caregivers? With the young kids, we talk about attachment and caregivers. And so if you have a child or adolescent who is abused, so the trauma that I typically see is violence. So sexual trauma, physical violence, domestic violence, community violence. And so when you think about children who have been abused or exposed to violence, what is their sense of security in their home, right? And if they're securely attached and the caregivers are attuned and they're able to meet their emotional needs, their emotional, psychological, developmental needs, then that relationship will be different from maybe a child who is ambivalent. So their attachment is like this push-pull, and they've experienced a trauma, and their caregiver, for whatever reason, no shade to the caregiver, because caregivers also have trauma history sometimes, not unusual, right? So if the caregiver cannot meet the needs of their child and their child's attachment style is ambivalent, then, push, pull from the kid. I need you, mom. Nope, go away as mom gives attention. I need you, dad. Nope, go away as dad gives attention. And, then that spills over into school, how they show up at school. Are they disorganized? The child, the adolescent, are they all over the place emotionally, emotionally dysregulated? And so on top of a disorganized attachment, a kid who is also, or adolescent. I say kid, when I say kid, I mean anyone 18 and under, or frankly, 26 and under. But when I say kid, I'm talking about a minor, right? Because the brain doesn't fully develop until mid-20s.
Right.
And I'm sure you and I both know adults, really old adults, and we think your brain's not fully developed either. But anyway, so that what is that relationship prior to the traumatic event? And then you have this traumatic event. How can the adults in these youth's lives step up for them, right? And I think that will inform codependency, right? I'm going to have very fluid boundaries as of relationship. And so, rather than being able to say no, I'm going to do something that I really don't want to do. But those relationships, that codependency, adults who've experienced trauma as adults, again, what is their, are they securely attached, and how does that show up with an adult, right? Are they also avoidant like children? Are they anxious in their attachment? And that influences how, one responds to a traumatic event. So an adult who is mugged, an adult who is in a violent relationship, domestic violence in their lives, or an adult who experienced it as a child. It's all intertwined.
Right.
Childhood experiences inform adult responses.
Yeah. I love how you said how we move in relationships. I love that. Right. And yeah, codependence, I think a lot of the misunderstanding comes from the historical definition, which is a codependent wife with the alcoholic husband. But yeah, it's how we move in relationships. And you talk about kids, you talk about adults, romantic relationships, work relationships, personal relationships. But yeah, I love how you said how we move. Because yeah, it just does tend to be a pattern. A universal pattern. And some relationships, it's more poignant and evident, but yeah, it really could just be how we move in the world. And then yeah, if we experience trauma, it just informs those behaviors.
Sure. And when I think about, how folks show up in personal relationships, and the boundaries being blurred, and there being this unhealthy interaction with the personal romantic relationships, where in other areas of their life, their boundaries are very clear and they're very articulate about what they will accept and what they won't accept, right? But then when you're in this romantic relationship, what happens? And so I think even with levels of codependency, and you tell me, this is your expertise, but it seems like that too is fluent. And so if there's like a spectrum, and I don't know that there is, but the
Yeah.
spectrum of codependency, maybe in intimate relationships, intimate romantic partner relationships, if 10 is completely codependent and, no sense of self, you might have a person who is 8 on this spectrum with romantic relationships, and then in their professional life, very clear about what their boundaries are.
Right.
When friendships, very clear about their boundaries. So
Yeah.
I don't know. It feels like there's this spectrum. I talk to women who say, I'm strong, I'm independent. I don't understand why I'm in this relationship, and I can see it's not a healthy relationship for me, and yet I keep returning to it.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So the patterns are right. It may be a way, codependency may be impacting how we move in relationships. And also those relationships in and of themselves may be more or less codependent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think so.
I totally agree. Yeah. Yeah. I remember like in my early 20s, I'd have very healthy boundaries in certain contexts.
Mm-hmm.
And then I did not know where I ended and my romantic partner began. So, yeah, thankfully it wasn't with everyone. I actually don't know if codependence if it's sustainable to be, out of 10 with everyone, thankfully. But yeah, varying degrees. What were you going to
So
say?
if it were an out of a 10 with everyone, it feels like there's a diagnosis in that, right?
Yeah, true.
But yes, you bring up, in your early 20s. In my early 20s, I can think about some things that I did, and I think back now and think, what were you thinking,
Oh,
right?
what'd you do? What'd you do?
Sure that I'm ready to share all of that. But just having behaviors that now as a adult, but not just an adult, but an adult who's had her own therapy, who has worked through, some of those childhood issues, worked through adolescent stuff, right? Which helps. This is why we do what we do.
Right.
Um, because, being a kid, teenager, young adult, and going to a boyfriend's house to see if he's there, and, taking a broom and waving it underneath the garage to see if it's going to hit a tire, to see. I mean, this is just craziness, right? You could pay me that much money. You could pay me enough money to care that much about, a romantic partner. And so I'm grateful that as an adult, um, but not because I just figured it out on my own, I had help
Right.
figuring it out along the way, right? A really good support system and really good therapy. And so, again, no shade to the folks who are struggling with independence and identity and, um, figuring out what relationships are going to be. There's no shame in that. None of us has it down perfectly, right? It's fluid, um, but also grateful that I was exposed to therapy early on and recognized the benefits of it, and that you're not crazy because you're, seeing a therapist. And, we as people of color, I think in our communities, you're crazy. Only crazy people go see therapists. while, we see folks in our community who are suffering.
Right.
And there's help. There are folks that can help them with what I'm calling relationship, and you call, codependency. I think it's the same thing.
Right.
Different side of the same coin.
Yeah. So, homing in on your specialty as a trauma therapist, Tomiko, how does childhood abuse or sexual assault affect identity? We'll start with that, but then if you can elaborate on how that can contribute to the development of codependent behavior.
Sure. So let's start with kiddos, right? Kiddos who are traumatized or victimized. So you can be sexually abused and not be traumatized by it, but certainly a victim of inappropriate behaviors. But let's say a kiddo's been abused and it's abused by a family member, right? And let's say it's a close family member, a caregiver. And that caregiver has defined the abuse as love, right? Or the caregiver has defined the abuse as, if you don't do X, then I'm going to withdraw Y. I'm going to withdraw love. I'm going to withdraw safety. I'm going to withdraw security. I'm going to withdraw food, right? So you have a youth whose brain is not fully developed, whose caregiver has transgressed. And the youth's understanding of love is how that caregiver has defined it, right? I've abused you. And if I couldn't abuse you, then I was going to withdraw your needs. Your needs weren't going to be met. Roll forward in relationships. So does relationship look like that relationship when it was unsafe, right? And so do you have children, adolescents engaging in risky behavior, risky relationship? And so what we see sometimes is children who have been sexually abused, in their effort to take back the power, I'm going to say who I have sex with, so it shows up as promiscuity, right? It shows up as in acting out behaviors. It shows up in substance abuse. But when, going back to relationship, I'm going to say who, when, how I have sex. And I'm going to choose all the people with whom I want to be sexually involved, right? But it's really just another way of being disempowered, right? And that expression of, well, now I'm going to define what love looks like, but their blueprint is from someone who has defined love and care and safety and security and stability in a way that's all wonky, right? So you see children attaching, so going back to attachment, to relationships that don't serve them. But if you don't have any scaffolding for healthy relationship, then you become involved with folks who are unsavory, folks who don't have your best interest in mind, folks who are physically violent, sexually violent as well, right? So, you talk to children who were in homes where there's domestic violence, and they say, when I grow up, I will never be that person. I will never be the recipient of violence, and I will never be the perpetrator of violence. And lo and behold, they end up in a relationship where there's violence, right? So, how does that happen? They didn't grow up and say, I'm going to be in a relationship where there's violence. In fact, to the contrary,
right.
I'm not going to be in those relationships. But if you don't learn something different, how do you not repeat what you've learned? And what I say is you throw a wrench in the cycle, interrupt it. And that interruption looks like therapy. So that the relationships that they are developing are more healthy. Never ever a perfect relationship, right? But they certainly can be healthy. Same with adults who are in those relationships that are not great, right? So really so as I'm still thinking and processing this, so codependency, it's like what's underneath it? What started it, right? We can treat the symptoms and we can give you tools, but what's its foundation? Right? Where let's talk about that.
Right.
Not you and I, but with the client. Let's talk about that foundation. My most of my work, or good chunk of my work, has been working with children and adolescents, right? And I feel like, so here's Frederick Douglass said, it's easier to build strong children than repair broken men.
Wow.
Right? So think about what we do, the adults that we see, how much of, or how, what percentage of adults do we see where what has shown up as an adult comes out of their childhood? A lot, good percentage. When you think
I'd say
about
100. I would.
Easier to build strong children than repair broken men, right?
Yeah.
When you think about the adverse childhood experiences study, the ACEs study, I think it's like 67, 68, almost 70% of folks who, or 70%, upwards of 70% of folks have experienced adverse childhood experience, have had some adverse childhood experience. Well, those childhood experiences inform your development. Abuse, domestic violence, mental illness, substance abuse, incarceration. Those are some of the items that were identified on the questionnaire. Divorce, emotional abuse. Easier to build strong children than repair broken men.
Yeah.
Or women.
Right. I am curious, Tomiko, just for the listener, to help with our understanding. You did say initially responding, you were like, not, oh gosh, I'm going to botch your words, but you alluded to not all traumatic experiences lead to the development of being traumatized.
So not all victims are necessarily traumatized, right?
You say, can you educate us? Like, yeah, it's not one for one. But that doesn't mean that those who develop or who are traumatized are weaker or.
Oh, absolutely not. This has nothing to do, trauma has nothing to do with emotional strength, physical strength, psychological strength. Trauma is exposure to something adverse, unusual, out of context. You can have a one-time traumatic experience, going through a hurricane, a traumatic experience, right? or you can have chronic traumatic experiences, a lifetime of abuse, living in poverty can be a traumatic experience, right?
Sexism.
Sexism, right? So I mean, there are many ways that we can be traumatized. So thinking about children who have, and adults too, I think this is true of adults, but thinking about a child who's been sexually abused. So you have a 4-year-old who is being sexually abused, but they don't recognize it as abuse. It was just a game. You know, me and the neighbor were playing a game. And hey, mommy, you want to play the game that, neighbor Joe played? And mommy's like, what are you talking about? Well, he touches my pee-pee and then I touch his pee-pee, right? So for that kid, they're not traumatized. It was a game, but they were absolutely victimized.
Right.
Right. I have adult clients who have experienced sexual assault, and it was not traumatic to them, right?
Wow.
But they were certainly victimized. So not every circumstance leads to a traumatic experience. So for the young kid who was abused, but was not traumatized by it, so they wouldn't need trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. It would be, let's give them some education about appropriate touches, inappropriate touches. What can you do? What can you say? Talk about safety. So doing some of that psychoed. Whereas a kid who's been traumatized, then you do the trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And with adults, that trauma, I think, also informs relationship. So going back to codependency. So the way adults who I think in my practice have experienced trauma, and the interesting thing is, so I'm going to digress a bit. It's the trauma doesn't necessarily is not the precursor to the codependency. It may be codependency was there, trauma occurred, which exacerbated relationship difficulties.
Do you want to elaborate on that?
So, so maybe, and it doesn't. So let's say a traumatic experience in childhood, being in a hurricane. The kid's life is great otherwise, but as a result of this hurricane, tornado, some natural disaster, earthquake, where we live, right? Earthquake, drought. But as a result of some natural disaster, the stability in their home.
I'm sorry. Apologize for this interruption, everybody.
Oh, I didn't hear the interruption.
Oh, nice. Okay. So, earthquake.
So natural disaster, right? Child experiences some natural disaster. And as a result of that natural disaster, the whole family is affected by it. Caregivers are trying to get their lives back together. They've lost their home, flood, wind, whatever. They've lost their home. So now a caregiver can't necessarily attune to their child's needs. Back to relationship. So back to attachment, right? Because caregiver is trying to figure out, how are we now going to get shelter and food and get our lives back to some semblance of something that we recognize. But in the meantime, the child is scared, right? Am I going to lose my caregiver? Am I going to lose, I have no home anymore. Where am I going to live? Where do I go back to school, right? So all of that can be traumatizing. Caregiver two is traumatized, somehow separating them from their child emotionally. So They get their lives back together. Kiddo seems to have gotten back together, and caregiver not realizing child is still afraid. They're still insecure. Relationship. Roll forward. Teenage years, early 20s, mid 30s, right? The untreated trauma from that disaster now may show up in relationships.
Right. I think if I were that child and I did go through an earthquake with my parents, right? So, pondering codependency being there initially and then being compounded by the traumatic experience, how I've coped at times is sensing my parents' distress and then doing what I can to lessen their distress. So then I lose, right, a sense of my identity. And it's like, how can I help? What can I do? What's going to contribute to more stress that I can intervene? And and then, in ongoing relationships, that's what I have done when things are, I don't know, if there was another earthquake, I would just be more focused on maintaining that attachment, right? But it would be through the mind reading, the needs reading, the self-sacrifice for them.
Watching all your behaviors, paying attention to how you're communicating with other folks.
Yeah.
Right.
I think I've talked about it on the podcast. It's so funny, like Christmas brings up a lot of memories, and my parents were always very stressed, like during the holiday season. And I think as a young child, I wouldn't label it as trauma, but I was then stressed because they're stressed. And I remember, oh my gosh, Tomiko, I was begging my twin sister on Christmas morning, please don't get up, Sonia. Please don't get up. We have to wait. We need to let mom and dad sleep more because they've been so stressed. And I think I knew Santa wasn't around any, it wasn't a, real person. And right, I was so conscientious, hyper conscientious of their need for sleep. I was like begging my twin sister, don't go out yet. And she's like, right. She's excited, right? That was her need in the morning. But I'd already started to develop this awareness of, I think that's one way I maintained my attachment, is by really just perceiving and trying to meet others. Yeah.
And it becomes this role reversal, right? And young you trying to maintain a particular vibe in the home, right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing about kids. They pay attention. They are watching their caregivers. And so, if you are hypervigilant as a kid, as an adult, you are hypervigilant. So you pay attention to facial expressions, body language, a twitch in the eyebrow, right?
Tone.
All of it. How you just walk, how you move your body, and so adults, that hypervigilance is taken into adult relationships. So thinking about a person who's in a violent relationship, a DV relationship, they're paying attention. They know before the front door opens the mood of the person walking through the door, right? If that's the violent person. And the youngster, as they're paying attention, this is, relationships are built on this foundation.
Right.
The foundation of codependency.
Right.
And how do we all we're human beings. We need relationship. Even those of us who, the adults who are avoidant of relationship, we still need relationship. So how do we develop healthy relations with others? And I don't know, there's fluency with codependency, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So like even in a healthy relationship, maybe illness pops up. In a parent-child, adult-child parent relationship, parent gets sick, child takes on that role. Parent gets well, child doesn't remove themselves from that role, or parent attempts to keep the adult child in that role. So it seems like, it ebbs and flows.
Right. Do you sense that having codependent, right, moving in relationships in a codependent manner could potentially lead to a vulnerability to exposure to more trauma than being more independent or interdependent?
I think so, because what if in that codependent relationship you can't use your voice, you don't feel empowered, and experienced some traumatic event where you felt disempowered, helpless, hopeless, and then you're in a relationship where you also feel helpless and hopeless, I think it can absolutely be triggering and re-traumatizing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How does one not make the connection, right? And it's not a conscious connection. I say we're attracted to what's familiar,
Mm-hmm.
and what's familiar may not be good for us. So for a child who's grown up in a home where there's DV, their adult relationship may be where there's domestic violence, not because on purpose, one is choosing to be in a violent relationship, but it's familiar.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, I think being in a codependent relationship can be re-traumatizing. It's like re-experiencing, and thinking about the clusters for PTSD, right? Re-experiencing avoidance, negative mood and cognition. So absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Is healing possible after experiencing
Absolutely.
trauma?
Absolutely.
Right?
Because
Because, well, I'm just really quick. Right. Let's imagine a listener who maybe looked like, sounded like, interacted with the world, right, moved in relationships a lot like I did in my 20s. And they're in a intimate relationship that is traumatizing. I remember an ex, like he just like, oh gosh, so many exes, but one of them, like he really kept like mostly cheating or almost cheating, just like over and over and over. And I'm in a work environment where yeah, more of the same. I'm just having to deal with disempowering and belittling protocols. And yeah, maybe it's the same with a close friend. So, it's coming at her from all sides, Tomiko. And she could just continue down this spiral of re-traumatization and codependency. What?
And so as clinicians, we absolutely have to believe and live and walk in hopeful. Otherwise, why are we doing what we're doing? If we didn't believe our clients can heal and find their own strengths, right? From inside. So, is there healing? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a one-shot deal? No.
No.
Right? So, someone has therapy, mental health services as a kid, as an adolescent, as a young adult, as a middle-aged person, as a person on their dying bed, right? Absolutely, there is healing. And I think as we grow and we experience the world, the way one experiences the world at 10 is different from how you're going to experience it when you're 20. It's different how you're going to experience it when you're 40 with two of your own children in a relationship, right? So I'm certain as we experience the world and the world experiences us, we're going to view things differently. Mm-hmm. And so what might have worked for me when I was 20, skills I had then, isn't going to work for me at 40 because I have different skills. I have different life experiences. I have different expectations of myself. I think about myself differently at 40 than I did at 20, than I will at 50, than I will at 70, right? So yes, there's healing and it's work. You just can't show up and say, oh, Marissa, I'm here, heal me. That's not how that works.
Right.
Marissa is a vehicle. It's a tool for me, Tomiko, to do the work. Mm-hmm. Right? Marissa's going to open the space.
Right.
So that I feel safe. She's going to gently challenge some of my beliefs. Tools to be able to sit with some of the pain. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, healing is possible.
Yeah.
Whether you're 4, 25, or 95. And you have to be willing to do the work.
Right.
I had a client recently say to me, this is hard. Mm-hmm. It can be.
Yeah.
Not every session necessarily needs to be hard.
It's the irony of life, which is taking those, that step towards healing and continuing on that path. It is hard, but it's also hard to be in, right, that relationship, right? Stay in that work environment, be disempowered. And so, yeah, at times with my patients and myself, I remind them gently and myself gently, like, I am choosing this hard.
Right.
This is hard over there,
right.
But this is my conscious choice of this work, this difficulty, this hard.
Yeah. I know, right?
Yeah.
And The fact that someone has Googled and then has sent the email or made the phone call, and then you schedule the appointment and they show up for the appointment, they keep the appointment, and then they schedule for the next appointment, right? All of that is hard.
Mm-hmm.
But once you've taken the one step and then the next step and then the next step, you know, we can walk that hard work journey together.
Right.
I had a client say to me, I don't like you, Tomiko. And this was at the end of the session, right? And I said, so are we scheduling for next week? Right? She said, yes. So it's okay. It's okay
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that it's difficult.
In addition to therapy, I'm curious what you've observed has bolstered, empowered, emboldened your clients on their healing journey.
Mm. So there's so many things that folks can do, and it's different from one person to the next. Moving your body is important.
Mm.
Whether it's, you know, a little bit of movement, a lot of movement, but I think moving your body is important. And I find, you know, just with me, when I'm particularly stressed, that's when I want to move my body more, right? And it just feels like, and moving it through space, so walking, when I was running, but you know, just moving it through space. Mindfulness, being present. I think we get so caught up in our everyday life, as all of us do, that we're not paying attention. So just paying attention. How am I feeling in this moment? Why am I so triggered by whatever it is? Why did the person who cut me off trigger such anger and rage? You know, what is that about? So really paying attention to one's body. I think community is really important. So friends, and with COVID, we've become physically as well as socially distant. So, you know, I still feel very connected to you through Zoom, right? We've so connecting with folks, you know, being able doing it in person, doing it on FaceTime or Zoom or whatever, you know, the video conference platform you have, I think that's really important. Laughing every day, laugh about something.
Mm.
In the pain of what you're going through, find something to laugh about. And it doesn't have to be a gut buster laugh. Now, if you see a kitten video and that makes you smile, go for it.
Mm-hmm.
You hear a baby giggling, and if that brings up, you know, a smile for you, go for it. Those things outside of therapy.
Mm-hmm. Movement, mindfulness, community, and laughter. Mm-hmm.
Grace for yourself, grace for others. The person who cut you off, maybe they're on their way to an emergency someplace, and they're trying to get there. Having grace.
Yeah. One of my, you know, we talk about self-acceptance, self-love, self-care, you know, self-grace. I think it's really important for codependence because we can just, you know,
Right.
it abounds for everybody else. But yeah, really, really consciously directing that towards ourselves.
Right.
Yeah, it's so paramount on the healing journey. Yeah.
I read somewhere, gratitude is self-love.
So I just thought, like, how can I practice gratitude for my codependency? Which is hard because sometimes I hate that I interact with the world like this and can't say things, can't do things. I think I can't. Yeah. But I've had guests on before talking about the gifts of codependency, and having more of a balance between, self, like perceiving my needs and others. That's the goal. But, it's good that I can perceive others' needs.
Right.
Yeah.
Because relationship is important. So, codependency or relationship. Codependency is relationship. So on this spectrum, are you losing some of yourself in relationship? And are there places where you feel whole, in relationship?
Yeah. All right, Tomiko. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me. This was fun.
Yes. If people want to hear more about you, where can they find you?
So I am Tomiko Mackey, and my website is mackeycounseling.com, MACKEY, counseling, COUNSELING.com, mackeycounseling.com.
Awesome. Okay, everyone, I will put a link to that in the show notes. And again, thank you for coming on. Thank you for listening, and we will see you guys next week.
Thank you, Marissa. It was great being in community.
Yes. Bye, everybody. Hey, girl. It's Marissa again. I'm not like a regular podcaster. I'm a cool podcaster, right? Thank you for listening and staying till the end. You can find me on Instagram at Therapy with Marissa. Email me, marissa@codependummy.com. Check out codependummy.com for more information on the show. And baby girl, a subscribe, rating, and review would be much appreciated. Till next time, I want you to remember, if you are feeling unseen, I see you. If you are feeling unheard, I hear you. And if you think that you don't matter, know that you matter to me. I want you to go out there so you can stop playing small and start taking up space, you dummy. And now, the disclaimer. Girl, this is not therapy, and I am not your therapist. This podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regards to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, publisher, or guests are rendering any legal, clinical, or other professional service. If you want or need a professional, please